Now we're going to cover combat. And the first thing we need to cover is close combat and the difference between player-initiated close combat and horrors-initiated close combat. Player-initiated close combat happens when the player takes a combat action during their activity phase, and they choose which horrors unit in their area they want to attack. So in this case, if Kevin Blart had taken a combat action and wanted to use his close combat, he could choose to either attack the Leper Messiahs or to attack this stack of Murder of Horrors tiles. Close combat initiated by horrors is slightly more complicated, with the reason being that at the end of an activation for the horrors, you can have multiple active horrors in an area with player units. And so you have to figure out how each of those active horrors matches up in a way that can create one or more close combats during that round. There's several variations, and we'll cover each of them, starting with the simplest one, which is a 1v1. In this case, I have one player unit, Kevin Blart, and one horrors unit, which is this stack of Murder of Horrors tiles in this area. Now, for this purpose, we don't pay attention to the civilians. I'll explain how civilians come into this later. But in this case, you have one close combat round pitting Kevin Blart against this stack of Murder of Horrors tiles. The next situation is when I have multiple player units and only one horrors unit. So in this case, I have both Kevin Blart and Dr. McCoy here. And in this situation, I as the player decide which of my units is going to defend in this close combat. So in this case, I would probably choose Kevin Blart because he has a 3 for close combat, as opposed to Dr. McCoy, who only has a 1. So I would perform one round of close combat, pitting Kevin Blart against this Murder of Horrors stack. The next situation is when I have 2 or more horrors units against one player unit. So the Leper Messiahs and the Murder of Horrors stack against Kevin Blart. In this case, each of these horrors units is going to conduct its own close combat against the single player unit in the space. So I get to choose the order in which I do them. So I could choose to conduct the Leper Messiahs versus Kevin Blart first, or I could do the Murder of Horrors stack versus Kevin Blart first. But I'll have 2 rounds of combat with each individual horrors unit against Kevin Blart. Now this is where the presence of the civilians matters. If let's say that I started by having Kevin Blart go against the Leper Messiahs, and the Leper Messiahs happen to eliminate Kevin Blart in combat. At this point, because I have the Murder of Horror stack, which has not yet attacked, and no player units, this Murder of Horror stack would then match up and attack the civilians in the space. But if the Leper Messiahs attack Kevin Blart and Kevin Blart survives, I would then have a second round of combat with the Murder of Horror stack against Kevin Blart, and the civilians in that case would not be attacked. Next is the most complicated case, which is when you have multiple horrors units and multiple player units. So the simplest way to think about this is that the player decides who matches up against who, but you just have to make sure that each of the horrors units is matched up against. So in this simple case where I have a Murder of Horrors stack and a Leper Messiahs unit, and I have 2 player units, I decide that Kevin Blart will match up against the Leper Messiahs, Dr. McCoy will match up against the stack, and so each of the horrors units is participating in its own separate close combat. If I was in a situation, however, where I had a 3rd horrors unit in this space, things are looking pretty bleak for the player here, I would still match things up as I described and conduct those 2 close combats. And then at the end of that, I could decide to match this remaining horrors unit up against either of these units if they survive. If they both didn't survive, I would match them up against the civilians. If, say, only Kevin Blart survived, I would match the infected Sasquatches up against him. If both of them survived, I could decide which one I want to match them up against. Now, if there's an excess of player units, let's say that the compound was here, because if you remember, you can have only 2 faction standees in a space, but the compound doesn't count against that limit. If I have an excess of player units in the space, then I choose which of my player units are going to match up, but the extra one or ones don't participate. So in this case, for example, I would probably say I'm going to match Kevin Blart up against the Leper Messiahs. I'm going to match Compound W up against this Murder of Horror stack, and Dr. McCoy is not going to participate. Finally, if horrors are alone in a space with nothing but civilians, you would conduct 1 close combat against the civilians, just totaling up all of the hit potential from your horrors units into 1 single close combat. So, having determined how many close combats are going to occur and who is matched up against who, let's talk about how close combat actually works. The first thing you have to do is determine the hit potential for the horrors unit in the close combat. For horrors mutations, standees, this is simple. You simply take the value, their close combat value. So in this case, for the infected Sasquatch, that's 3. So the infected Sasquatch would do 3 potential hits. For Murder of Horrors stacks, it depends on how many units are in that stack and what type of terrain the close combat is occurring in. So here I have a Murder of Horrors stack that has 5 units in it, and if I am fighting in urban terrain, I divide the number of tiles by 4 and round up. So 5 divided by 4 gives me 2 potential hits for this Murder of Horror stack. If the combat was taking place in a forest, I divide by 3. So in that case, 5 divided by 3 would still end up giving me 2 potential hits. If it's happening in clear terrain, I divide by 2. So in that case, 5 divided by 2 would give me 3 potential hits. And if you don't want to do math, there's a handy chart. So you can just look at the number of units and the terrain, and it will give you the hit potential for that close combat. Having determined the horror's hit potential, which in this case is 2, we determine how many dice the player is going to roll. So we'll check their combat rating. In this case, it's a 3. So that means they're going to roll 3 dice. And the die roll is going to have one of 5 possible results. There's a blank, which means nothing happens. There's a full heart, in which case you do 1 hit worth of damage. There's a partial hit. You need 2 of these to make a full hit. 1 single partial hit is a nothing result. There's a shielded result, which reduces the horror's hit potential by 1. And there's a critical hit. If you roll a critical hit, you get 1 hit and you roll the die again. And if you roll another critical hit, you get another hit and you roll again, and you can keep doing that so long as you roll critical hits. So for this example, let's say that we rolled these 3 results. So we got a partial hit, a shield, and a critical hit. So we'll roll again for the critical hit. I'll just grab this die here and we'll roll it again for the critical hit. And in this case, we got a full hit. So that means that the damage that we do is 1 full hit and 1 for the critical hit, and nothing for the partial hit because it's only a partial hit. And we reduce the horror's hit potential by 1. So what that means is that we did 2 hits worth of damage and the horrors did 1 hit worth of damage. So now we move on to apply the damage that occurred in this close combat. And all of the damage is applied simultaneously to both sides. So we did 2 hits worth of damage to the Murder of Horrors stack. And when you're dealing with a Murder of Horrors stack, you just remove the number of tiles that you did worth of damage. So in this case, I did 2 damage, so I removed 2 Murder of Horrors tiles, and I just put them back in their bag here, so they can spawn again later. The horrors did 1 hit worth of damage to me. So for that, I come over here and I place a hit cube on my in the toughness area of that character on my faction sheet. So I took 1 hit worth of damage, I placed 1 hit cube here. And a quick note that if I had been fighting the Horror's mutation instead, you apply hits to Horror mutations the same way you do to player characters. So I would go over to the Horror's stack, or the Horror's faction mat, I'm sorry, and I would place 2 hit cubes on it to represent the fact that I did 2 damage. So now let's talk about units getting eliminated. When we're talking about Murder of Horror's stacks, if you eliminate the last unit in the stack, you just remove the entire stack from the board, and these tiles will spawn again later. When we're talking about standees, so whether that's Horror's mutation standees or player standees, each unit has a toughness rating. So for our infected Sasquatches, that toughness rating is 4. If the number of hit cubes in this toughness area is ever equal to that toughness rating, so in this case, if I had 4 hit cubes on this, that unit is permanently eliminated from the game. So you can take them out, put them back in the box, you can put them back here. It doesn't really matter. They're just off the board and out of the game. When it comes to player standees, however, and when I say that, I mean both faction standees and NPC standees, they get what's called a last stand attempt to avoid dying when the number of hit cubes equals their toughness rating. So again, let's say that we had gotten enough hits on Dr. Corey to eliminate him. What you do is you check their bravery rating, and that bravery rating is this red number underneath the star. So in this case, it's a 2. So I draw a fate card, and I check the fate number. So in this case, I drew a 6. If the fate number is higher than the unit's bravery rating, that standee is removed from the game, the same as we discussed with the Horrors unit. They are out of the game permanently. If, however, the fate number is less than their bravery number, in this case a 1, I reduce the number of hit cubes to be 1 less than their toughness rating, and then I can move the unit out of this area into an adjacent area. So in this case, let's say we'll move him back here. If Horrors units are attacking civilians, basically civilian units have 1 toughness rating and they do no damage whatever to the Horrors units. So in this case, where I have a stack which has 3 murders of horror, it has a hit potential of 1, I would remove 1 civilian unit from the game. It's just out of the game forever. A couple exceptions. There are some VIP civilians units that have, in this case, a toughness rating. There's also a VIP civilians unit that has a close combat rating. So this VIP civilians unit would require 3 hits in order to eliminate, and the one with the close combat rating would be treated very much like a player character and roll dice to determine what happens in combat. 2 final steps to close combat. First, if a Murder of Horrors stack eliminates any units in combat, you add a tile to the stack for each unit that it eliminated. So in this case, where we, in this most recent example, where we eliminated this civilians unit, I would grab an extra tile and add it to this stack, now turning that into a 4 tile Murder of Horrors stack. This is to represent them infecting the population or people that they attack in combat. The other thing that happens is that I add a biohazard cube to the biohazard bag. So I'm going to add cubes from this yellow first, and after all the yellow are gone, I'll start adding red. So because that was a close combat, I grab 1 and I put it in the bag. Now, if you go back to examples we talked about where there were multiple Murder of Horrors units or multiple player units in a space, and we talked about there being individual close combats that go on as you match them up, that's important here because if there are 2 individual close combats that go on in a single area, you add 2 cubes to the bag, not 1. So you add a cube to the bag for each individual close combat that occurs. So now let's talk about range combat and gunship combat, both of which play out pretty much exactly the same. This type of combat can only be used by units with either a range combat rating, which in this example is the white 2 under the white crosshairs on J. Friday's standee, or helicopters or boats with a gunship combat rating, in this case a 3 next to a red crosshairs. Now if you remember from earlier, we talked about the fact that units could target horrors units that are either in the same area as them or in an adjacent area. So let's say that Officer Friday here is going to perform range combat. He can either target this Murder of Horror stack that is in the same area as him, either of these 2 Murder of Horror stacks which are in adjacent areas because there are connections. He cannot target this Murder of Horrors stack because there's no connection, and so these 2 areas are not adjacent. And it doesn't matter that there's a Murder of Horror stack in the area with him, he can still target any of the Murder of Horror stacks that we talked about. When you perform range combat using any faction unit, whether that's a faction standee, a compound unit, or the Special National Guard Army Hog unit, you have to pay 1 supplies in order to conduct that range combat. So let's keep with our example where Officer Friday is using range combat. We come over to the Plum Island Constabulary faction mat and we reduce our supplies by 1. We pay 1 supplies for that range combat. NPC units, when used for range combat, do not pay supplies. So if I were to use the Shore Patrol here, which has a range combat rating of 2, or the Alyssa here, which has a gunship rating of 2, I could perform range combat using an action during my turn, and I don't have to pay supplies in order to do it. Having paid any supplies that you need to and chosen a target, in this case, let's say we're targeting this Murder of Horrors unit in the same area as me, you roll dice equal to your range combat rating. So in this case, we would roll 2 dice. Most of the results are exactly the same with the exception of the shielded result. Because the horrors aren't actually doing any damage to you, when you roll a shielded result, if the target is in a clear area, you do 1 hit. If they are in a building or a forest area, you do no hits. So having done 2 partial hits, that means that I have done 1 hit. I remove 1 Murder of Horrors tile, put it back in the bag. And that is the end of range combat. Now this is really crucial. When you perform range combat, you do not place a cube in the biohazard infection bag. And this is one of the reasons why range combat is really important despite the supply cost, because it allows you to whittle down the horrors units on the board without adding biohazard cubes to the bag, which as we know raises the biohazard level, which increases the number of units that spawn and can lead to you losing the game automatically. Okay, now we're going to get into how you win or lose this game. But before we do that, we have to talk about overrun. Now you remember from earlier, we talked about the fact that overrun areas are any areas whose identifier is in a yellow box. And most of them are here at the bottom of the board. There is one over here as well, the Great South Bay Bridge. But most of them are here at the bottom of the board. And an area becomes overrun the moment there is a horrors unit there and there are no civilian units, there are no faction units, and there are no NPC units there. So in this case, this Murder of Horror stack is there and there's nothing else there. So we would place an overrun marker in that area. Now, a couple of small caveats to that. The horrors unit cannot be stunned. If a horrors unit is stunned, you wait until you remove the stunned marker to place the overrun marker. The other caveat is that boats and helicopters don't prevent an overrun. So once an area is overrun, it remains overrun for the rest of the game. This marker never comes off the board. And you do a couple of things. The first is that you actually remove from the game all of the Murder of Horrors, all of the horrors units that are in the area that caused the overrun. So we would simply delete these. In tabletop, we would simply delete these because they are out of the game. And then we check how many overrun points are caused by that area being overrun. So in this case, the VFW Memorial Park got overrun, so we would add 2 overrun points to the overrun points track. There's one other situation in which you can get overrun points, and that's if you are ever required to spawn Murder of Horrors units and you don't have enough left in the bag to fully satisfy that spawn. So in this case, let's say that I was trying to spawn on track 1, but I only have 1 tile left in the bag. You would spawn as many as you can, and then you add 1 to the overrun points track. You only add 1 for each time it happens, not for how many tiles you're unable to spawn. Finally, let's talk about winning and losing the game. There are 3 ways that you can instantly lose the game, which means you lose the game the moment it happens. The first 2 we've already talked about. One is that if the biohazard level reaches this 17 plus base, the moment that happens, you immediately lose. The players immediately lose the game. The second, similarly, is if the total overrun points reaches the 8 plus marker on this track, at which point the players immediately lose the game. The third way that you can immediately lose the game is if any of the factions in the game lose all of their units. So if all of their standees and their compound unit are eliminated, then you lose the game at that moment as well. One note about this is if you lose all of your standees before your compound is built, it still qualifies as a loss in that case. If you reach game round 9, the end of game round 9, and you haven't lost the game, the next thing that you do is you check to see how many evacuation points you've gotten. Now remember, at this point, you have to go and check all of your compounds on the board and score points for any civilians that have reached the end of game round 9 and are inside of compounds. But after you do that, you check your evacuation points. If it is less than 26, the players lose the game at that moment as well. However, if at that point you have 26 or more evacuation points, you have achieved the 1 victory condition for the players in this game. And there you have it. Now you know pretty much all that you need to know in order to play the Plum Island Horror. I haven't covered every single rule, obviously, but there's a really handy reference guide in the game that covers a lot of situations as they come up and can be a really great sort of resource during gameplay to look things up as you need to understand them. My next goal with the Plum Island Horror is I'm actually going to record playing through several solitaire games so that you'll then be able to see all of these rules in action and hopefully get a real feel for how the game plays. So hopefully you'll join me for those. Thanks and bye. As always, like, subscribe, leave a comment, tell me what kind of content you'd like to see, but hopefully you've enjoyed this and hopefully now you know how to play the Plum Island Horror.